All right, we're live, everyone, back on the Philosophy of Art and Science show here, or podcast if you like. You can support the program, as always, by subscribing to the newsletter at aksum.substack.com, heading over to patreon.com/tawahado, or joining the channel directly. You could also, if you want to be involved, throw up some super stickies or super chats to make sure that you're more involved in the process and your questions or comments, concerns, points of emphasis get addressed. Returning to the show is my brother Rmani. Actually, he was on the Tawahado Bible study, and we covered Obadiah before. So if y'all haven't gone and heard that good word, go back and listen to us read Obadiah in its entirety, because it's only one chapter. So it's a beautiful way of getting into the scroll or the book of the 12, the minor prophets at the end of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. My brother Rmani, happy Black History Month. How are you doing today?
Yes, sir, man. Likewise, I'm doing great, man. I couldn't help but notice that you must be doing great. I see you got the smooth silky on. So,
you got to press them waves down. You know what I'm saying? This man Rmani cut my hair like 6 years ago, and my wave's been right ever since.
No, I do appreciate it, though. I do. But I have nothing to do with your waves, brother.
I mean, you are a barber, you are a preacher, a herald of the good word, the good news. But here we're going to talk about some things that have been changing in the state of California. This fine republic that we're here in the United States is very fascinating because the laws change from state to state. I want to set it up a little bit because you texted us in our group chat. Actually, Rmani and I have this esteemed privilege of not just being friends and alumni from one school, but we did what some people call academic incest, in that we went to the same school twice, undergrad and grad school. And I think it's a beautiful thing. So we're double alumni in that way.
Yes.
So anyway, we're in a group chat and you sent me this thing and I immediately praised God because it's, I'll be honest with you, it's not where I want us to be, but it's on the road. And one of my favorite quotes, I'm going to butcher it now, from MLK is that if you can't fly, you run. If you can't run, you walk. And if you can't walk, you crawl. You do whatever you can with whatever your situation is. And to me, this is either walking or crawling. And I eventually want us to run and fly. So I like what this does for people. But so Lysander Spooner is this figure from quite a long time ago in the 1800s. And in his time and day in Massachusetts, you had to get a degree and then work kind of as an apprentice for 5 years. He went and avoided the degree and he worked as an apprentice for about 3 years, and he stood in defiance of the laws, and he just kept practicing law anyway, even though they said that he couldn't do it. And he eventually had some campaigns where he fought the mailman because he said, let me pull up one of the quotes from him. He says, "No one has yet ever dared advocate," and of course, a lawyer, another word for lawyer is advocate, "in direct terms, so monstrous a principle as that the rich ought to be protected by law from the competition of the poor." So he saw the way in which they made people who couldn't afford college degrees spend 5 years versus 3 years, which is, an arbitrary number. There's no like deep science behind those numbers. He saw it as an attack on the poor. And he had the kind of ethos of Airbnb and Lyft way before the sharing economy existed, where he said, listen, if people don't want to pay these people working in private practice, they're going to lose on the market in terms of competition. But why don't you just let them compete? Why wouldn't you let Lyft and Uber compete with taxis? Why wouldn't you let Airbnb compete with hotel? Why don't you let poor folks who don't meet your arbitrary qualifications get there? In a more modern day company, there's a law firm that's also a nonprofit I've given to a lot in the past, full disclosure, called IJ, the Institute for Justice. And they go around. Recently, they've done cases for African hair braiders who've been forced by certain standards to spend like 10 G's on cosmetic school, which has, nothing. It's about makeup, nothing to do with actual hair braiding skills they bring from the motherland. They've reached out to them Catholic brodies. So shout out to Nate, who've been selling caskets, and they're trying to make them have occupational licensing for caskets, people who do tour buses. I talked about with my man Jonathan the other day street vendors, and they defend these people and they sue local governments, whether it's the county, the state, the federal. Anyway, I've blabbered enough. Talk to us about what is changed in California regarding who gets to practice the law, and what type of significance does this have for people?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I mean, that's like I've never heard of, what's the gentleman's name?
Lysander Spooner.
Lysander Spooner. I got to do some more research on him, but yeah, but we need more Brodies like him for sure. But yeah, so the things that have changed in California. So in July of last year, they decided to lower the cut score. So it basically went from a scaled score of 144 to a scaled score of 139 moving forward. And so they came out with a decree, kind of, I think, somewhat in light of the pandemic. They had to move the bar exam back. And so they started a provisional licensure program. One of the main prongs was that for any exams moving forward, this new cut score would apply. And then just this past January, so like maybe 3.5 weeks ago, the board had a meeting, and they decided that they were going to make this new scaled score of 139 or 1390 retroactive for the last 5 years. And so they decided that anyone who had this score that would qualify you moving forward, if you have gotten that same score within the last 5 years of taking the bar exam, provided that you had 300 hours of supervised practice, you could be admitted into the California bar without having to retake the bar exam. And so I don't think I've ever heard of any state doing anything retroactively. I know about kind of making new edicts and new declarations moving forward, which is exactly what they did. But as I was doing research on it, trying to figure out like where exactly did this come from, or exactly kind of what was the path that was traced in order to bring this about. There were a couple students that really started kind of a petition and a protest, but more so of a petition, basically just asking the California courts or the board to consider making it retroactive. And initially they said no. So the first time, I think it was maybe September or October, don't quote me on the exact dates, but somewhere in that time frame, the California bar came out and said, no, we're not going to do that, but we will lower it moving forward. But then, like I said, about 3.5 weeks ago, they decided, you know what, we're going to make it retroactive for the previous 5 years. And so, and what it does, it just, like California and Delaware have the 2 highest cut scores in the country. And so what ended up happening is that your score would make you able to practice law in just about every state except for California. That's how high it was. And so like the score that I got, I would have been eligible to practice in just about every state except for California. I think Delaware. And so you end up, and another thing about the kind of the licensure program is that for most states, there's not any reciprocity. And so since California doesn't accept anyone else's bar exam, no one accepts California's exam. And so there are about, it's crazy, right? So there are about 30 states that are on the uniform bar exam. And so basically that's just one exam that you can take. And each state will still kind of have a different score, but it's one exam. And so if you take that exam, depending on your score, you can waive into different states so long as your score is above that. But California is one of the states that is not on the uniform bar exam. They're on their own exam. And so, as I said, there's no reciprocity. So if you want to practice in California, you're going to have to take the exam in California.
You see, I come at it from a position of obviously politics and dispute resolution and that kind of point of view, which is a different point of view than perhaps a student. But in my own life, due to the pandemic, what I've seen, I actually applied to a PhD program, and I had taken the GRE for my master's degree several years ago. And so the score had actually expired. And I was literally having debates with close family and friends about whether I'm going to subject myself to taking the GRE again, because it's hard for me to express this, but almost everything in my being hates the sort of validation that people seek and place in these scores, which I think is really just a greater expression of not someone's intelligence in a broad sense, or in a sense that would be applicable and functional, but in a who could color in the lines, like at a public kindergarten. You know what I mean? Who is cookie cutter? You know, who is obedient? Who can afford these courses, these books, and who's willing to put in the time? Like, there's a lot of creativity, individuality, and that expression that I see missing from it. And I'm not trying to throw too much shade, but this decision, I think, highlights to me, I kind of set this up in that way, something that comes off as arbitrary. Do you, in your experience, talking to various professionals and students, what type of justifications do they give for the fact that each state, like, I understand the political authority is there, but what kind of justification do they give for the varying, you know, scores? And does that actually pan out in terms of the quality of the practitioners of the law in the various states?
Yeah, like, I haven't heard, like, and I've been waiting to hear. I've been listening for years. I've been waiting for some reason that really grasped me, you know, that I could really hold on to, that, okay, that really makes sense. But I think for the most part, it really does truly seem arbitrary. And like, I understand having different bar exams because there are different laws in various states, but to have the scores be so, like, to be in one state and say you can know this much of the intended information we want you to know, and that's good enough, and it can be a completely different scale 10 miles over, you know, down the road that way, depending on what state you take it in. So in that sense, it is extremely, in my opinion, arbitrary. And it's like, it is like, there's a couple of thoughts that's running through my head at the exact same time. But I think one of the things that, especially with the legal industry, I think there is like, it really is just, at some point, it just becomes a bunch of hurdles that that one has to jump over. And as you're jumping over them, as I've jumped over them, I always wonder, why did I have to jump over that? You know, and I'm saying, you're making me do all these things that I don't really need to do. Because you go through law school, you have to take all these classes. They're graded on a hard curve. You have to pass all your classes. You got to graduate. And then you have to take this bar exam that you literally have to put your life on hold for 3 months. Like, most people can't do really anything else while they're studying for that.
And let's pause on that for a sec, because I think for you and I, it's obvious. But for those who don't know, the last time I checked, and you could correct me if you know any updated information, you get the Juris Doctor, the JD, as a prerequisite, having to take the LSAT first, then you get your JD, then you go for the bar in your state. In California, last I checked, you can forego the LSAT and JD as prerequisites if you work at a firm in some capacity for 3 years, but you still then have to take the bar, for which there are the sundry scores that we're talking about. Is that, you know, to the best of your knowledge, is that still kind of the practice in Cali?
But there are also a couple other steps. You've got a moral character application, which is like, it's like 30 pages, man. It is intense, and it costs, I think, several $100s to submit that. And then you also got to take what is it called? I'm forgetting the exact title, but it's basically an exam on ethics. So you've got to take an ethics exam as well, apart from the bar exam. All these things cost a significant amount of money along the way. So it really is like just a number of hurdles that you start to realize you need money to really even if you have all the intelligence, if you don't have the money, good luck. You know what I'm saying? There aren't really any scholarships for many of these programs. And so there's a financial bar, there's a time bar, there's an effort bar that really, in order to do it, you have to kind of really put your life on hold for a season. And for some, that's not really realistic. And so as I've just gone through the various steps, I've just been thinking to myself, like, man, this doesn't make any sense at all. 'Cause I'm thinking, especially when you realize what the bar exam entails and what the practice of law actually entails, I struggle every day to see the correlation between why you made me go and memorize all of these things. I mean, these large amounts of information when in practice, the information is readily available to you. You have everything you need is right there. The main thing is, are you able to analyze the legal issue correctly in light of the right rules? But we don't require people to memorize hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of rules. There's like 14 major subjects that you can get just on the essay portion. And each of those outlines, like when you boil down the main information, each of those outlines when you're studying for the bar exam, at the very least are going to be 50 pages. So you do the math on that. And you're really expected to retain 70 to 80% of that information to give yourself a viable chance to pass the exam. There is no real correlation between what they're having you do. So at some point you realize this is just a bar. Like, do you have the time? Do you have the money? Do you have the resource to actually be able to bunker down? And then we'll let you in, even though you've already passed all of your law classes. You've already shown that you can do what is required. A lot of times you have internships and supervised legal hours, and even just in order to graduate. And so you've already displayed everything that it takes to practice the law, but then you may not be able to because of this exam that really has no correlation and is unduly burdensome. Like, it truly is. And I'm not generally one to complain, but it really is an exam that you wonder, like, why, like, how did this become? Like, my thought process the whole time, it's like, who thought of this? Like, who said that this is how we're going to justify people in order to practice law?
Yeah, and as I begin, getting older, the thing that I begin to contemplate is, what is the reason behind this? And I stopped taking what people say at face value, which leads me to wonder, especially the way you pitted it. You walked it back after you said protest, but you had, whether Freudian slip or not, this idea of petition and protest. Mm-hmm. It makes me wonder who is being privileged here. I know in the internship space, mm-hmm. there are a lot of conversations people have about how in journalism, in media, and in many other fields, the people who are able to afford taking that much time out of their life are the ones who already have this sort of economic privilege or status, and whether it be parents' wealth or whatever, that affords them the time to be able to take this loss. Whereas more working class, more poor folks, more folks in need, they don't have time. They have to be working while doing that. I know in Los Angeles, there's the People's College of Law, which takes that into account. And so I think they got a part-time program where they allow people, to do law school just with evening classes for like $3,000 or $4,000 a year. Like, very, very affordable. And that's like intentionally with this economic justice or social justice minded thing. Do you think there's an economic justice perspective? For example, many of the issues that have been raised over the past years, beginning, of course, with what was viewed as police brutality, but it may be extending to other categories like the practice of law itself.
Yeah, like I would definitely say that there are so many justice aspects at play here. Economic is one of the big ones. At every point, is going to cost money. It costs a significant amount of money to attend law school. For all of the applications, just to verify that you have character is like, I have to pay you $700 to fill out this thing, and then you can decide if I have character. It's like, who made it?
Ironically, sounds like a bribe.
Right. It's like, who even made these things up? And then a bar prep course is going to be several $1,000s at least, probably $1,500 to $2,000 at least. Like, that's average. And you just start to realize and the bar exam costs money, several $100s. And so at each point, it costs a significant amount of money. And you just start to realize, like, we know just from the history, without even having to look at how did we get here per se, just when we look at different economic or socioeconomic classes, we can start to see that certain communities have just on average have less money. And so if there is a money bar, a significant money bar, like you need extra money to play with or prepare to take out significant amount of loans, that is a significant factor. Just a quick anecdote, something that even shocked me a little bit. I was on the trial team at Pepperdine, and so we would go to different trial competitions. And I went to the Santa Monica courthouse. We had a competition there, and I'm walking in, I have my suit on, and the security guard stops me, and you would have thought he saw Michael Jordan or something. He was so moved by the fact that I was coming in not as a defendant, but I was coming in as an attorney. Once he found out I was in law school, I was about to be an attorney. I mean, he was like, I'm here every day, and I see people look like you. He gave me a hug. I met someone else in the parking lot who worked in the courthouse, and they too stopped me. And I started to realize this is Santa Monica. And they're seeing me in a suit as not a defendant, and it's moving them almost to tears. And so you start to realize the amount of people who look like you and I, who are in the courtroom every day, who aren't attorneys. And that's a significant problem, because we know, like, we can go down a lot of rabbit holes on how we got to there, and maybe why the laws are set up in the way that they are. That may even move us a bit theological. But just on the surface, as we see, like, I'm thinking of, even as that verse says, like, all creation is groaning, for the reconciliation of things. I don't know, my computer just did something.
No worries. I'll match your anecdote with another anecdote. So
There we
he's
go.
talking about n+1.
Yes.
Now we'll make it n+2.
Yes.
And maybe people in the comments and who watch this later after this broadcast will make it n+many. And so the data will become more significant. Mm-hmm. I used to be a mediator in the Los Angeles Superior Court, and I used to be in Van Nuys, Inglewood, Downey, downtown. But the time I spent the most time in Inglewood. Yeah. And when I was at the Inglewood has a lot of Ethiopians, So I remember there was an Ethiopian brother who used to work, and a lot of Ethiopians do this typically, the cash kind of parking lot employee. And there are a few other positions, might be janitorial staff, or, like, it could be anything in the courthouse. I actually have a good friend who's in the sheriff's department too. So, I mean, they could be anywhere. And actually he surprised people too. The sheriff, he surprised deputy sheriff, but he surprised people too, being in that position. You don't expect that. But I used to walk in, and when they realized I was a person who was a mediator working in the courtroom, they would get really shook, because they never saw that before. And they're like, oh, you work inside? Not just like on the periphery, but like you're in the room? Like the judge lets you speak? And that was fun. And there were a lot of interesting dynamics there. Of course, my job was to get in the courtroom to take people outside the courtroom and settle things outside. But it was very interesting that I ran into that same dynamic. I had an interview one time. It didn't pan out, but it was like the third interview at one of these big arbitration tribunals in downtown LA one time. And security guard thought I was there to interview for a security guard position. And when I let him know, no, I'm interviewing for one of the arbitration positions, he gave me the biggest dap that I've ever seen. And it was so funny, because like 2 6-foot brothers, like, but different jobs, Yeah. He saw the guns a little bit. I was there for security. But that's not what I was there for. So that's and I like that you connected it theologically for reconciliation, because you have John the Baptist as the forerunner, but he's called the greatest amongst all born of women, but the least in the kingdom is greater than he. And he is the street sweeper for the Lord Jesus, who getting rid of the old Adam, becoming the new Adam, is that first amongst the fruit of the dead. And through his resurrection, which is going to be very different than ours, we are resurrected unto life, to judgment. He's resurrected unto power, sitting at the right hand of his Father, and he's the one who's going to judge. But just the fact that his resurrection impacts our resurrection, when you see somebody in a place where you have never been before, it gives you the hope to aspire to be in that place as well. So I don't think you're off when you make that connection. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And like just I think stand in that line. Like there are a couple other times too when I went to, like, I did a justice clinic where we took domestic violence cases, and so I was supervised, but I got to argue a case in the court. And again, walking in, there just was a shocking, and it obviously, like, you know it, but to see the reaction firsthand and realize people who are watching the flow, the ebb and flow of the judicial system every single day. Like, all it takes is we can drive to our county jail and just look. We can just go in and see, like, just pull up the numbers. Okay, what are, just kind of break it out. Who exactly is housed here? And then we see we have a big problem. And I like the idea, like you said, of reconciliation, and John the Baptist kind of being the forerunner to create space for Christ to creep in. And as we know, like, Christ talks about, he's come that we might all be one. And I think, especially in our lives, whenever we see division, that's really the door in. It doesn't matter necessarily how the division got there in the first place. Once the division is there, that there's an open door for chaos to ensue. And so I think what we're called to do is to use our gifts in any way to help systematically tear that down, especially when we have injustice at play. And so, I mean, it's been quite a journey. One other story that I don't think I've really ever shared. We had a competition down in Alabama. It was in Alabama.
Sweet home Alabama.
And so we, like my team, we prepare our semester. We go down to Alabama. We win our first 2 rounds. But we lose our 3rd round. And the way it works is, like, you have the preliminary rounds, kind of like debate. I know you did debate. You kind of the preliminary rounds, and then you go to the playoffs. They select some teams that have scored high enough. And so, and they break out the scores. And so you can get awards for different things. And so I got the highest score for my closing argument from all of the judges except for one. And this one judge gave me this gentleman from Alabama. He gave me the lowest score in the whole competition. So I got the highest score from all the judges, and there was one particular judge that gave me the lowest score. We had a gentleman on who was our coach, who traveled with us. He was about 90 years old. So he'd been practicing the law for 50 years. He'd been working in academics for about 30 years, teaching. And he looked at the score. He says, "I've never even seen a score this low." And it was so low that it prohibited our team from even moving forward in the competition. And it was just like, and everyone in all the other judges, our coaches were like, what just happened there? And then after that, we end up going to the Civil Rights Museum and the Lynching Museum that's right there in Birmingham. And it was just, for me, it was an eye-opening experience. It was like, I think sometimes when you do have a certain degree of privilege, you can't forget that there are still undercurrents of injustice and perhaps prejudice that prohibit. And so even me coming into the courtroom just as a participant, this was a sitting judge. And so if I'm coming in as a courtroom, every other judge there is saying this is actually the best, and you're saying it's the worst. You have to wonder, and there's no recourse. You have to wonder, if you were just a young man coming into his courtroom, what kind of justice would you be getting? And knowing that there's little to any oversight on a judge, and we have a judicial system that can hold prejudices and biases without ever having to come to the table and really fully address them. And I think that's the current system that we have now. And so we absolutely do need forerunners like John, who are willing to suffer a little bit, but who are willing to lean into these spaces to be that voice of justice, to be those hands and feet that start to say, no, something's off here. Something's not right about what's going on. And so we need more people like you who are willing to be those mediators, the way Christ is a mediator between God and us, helping us out. And so the more I've looked and seen what we call our justice system, the more I see we are far way away from true justice. And so I don't know quite exactly how to get there, but I know with enough of the right minds and right hearts that we can. But I think we have everyone at a point now that they're crying out for that justice.
Yeah, it's very funny. You and I grew up, me even more so, in more cosmopolitan areas, especially me. I'm like the epitome bi-coastal elite.
Yeah.
You were at least a little bit outside the city, but still you were in the north.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that, we're not accustomed to that level of repugnance where it's so obvious, like there's no questions anymore.
About this.
Yeah. I've had a few experiences in Calabasas, where I went to high school, and a little bit that I was like, ooh, that's tasty. Like that's right there. That's that real stuff. It's not like, I
that's diluted. Right.
In the Midwest, they're more slick about it,
right.
But some people are more obvious about it, and it's good. I'm glad they didn't give you some average mediocre. I'm glad they gave you the worst that a 90-year-old has ever seen and the best. Like those extremes, those ends, I think highlight your character maybe more than a 30-page document would. And it's very interesting. I heard a similar anecdote from Roy Jones Jr. about his time in the Olympics while he was an amateur boxer. And the South Korean boxer he fought actually admitted that he believes the decision should have been in favor of Roy Jones. And he said, I'm glad that he did that. Otherwise, I would have sought in another venue getting my lick back. But because he acknowledged it, at least, right, he felt that he got justice, if not from the judges of that boxing match, from the fighter. And for him, that was enough as a man, and with that, that honor. So that is so interesting that would happen in Sweet Home, Alabama.
And even just to piggyback off of you, I know you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the last time we talked in a forum like this was about Obadiah. And one of the things we talked about is that a lot of the times when judgment comes, it's coming on not necessarily individuals, but systems that have become so diluted that justice can no longer find a viable path to actually flow through it. And I'm afraid to say it, the more I've studied the law, I've looked at the justice system, we're relatively close, if not already there, to a system that the arteries are so clogged that justice can't even get through. You have so many arbitrary hoops and documents and systematic biases and prejudices that are so deeply ingrained that have codified to the point that now, even when we see injustice, even when everyone is on the same page on what should happen, somehow we still get to a different outcome than what justice would suggest, and what the common conscious, the common conscious would suggest. And when that becomes the place, then we've really got to start to truly evaluate. When you get in the room and everyone can say, oh yeah, this is unjust, this is what should happen. And then you go to your judicial system and realize it's going to be a far cry for that to actually happen. That's when you really have to start to evaluate. And we need sweeping changes in our system. And so you're right, like you said, until you can run and fly, we've got to crawl and walk. And this is crawling to me. You know what I'm saying? But I think it's starting to get to the point where we're starting to admit there's a problem here. And then if you don't admit something, then it's going to be very difficult, if possible at all, to repent of it. And we need great repentance in our justice system. We've got brothers still sitting in jail right now for marijuana, while I'm watching businesses thrive, making millions of dollars for the same thing. Brothers is still right now, as I'm looking at my watch today, still behind bars for it. Like, such should not be. And that's only one small example. I mean, there are literally thousands of other examples. And so we've got a long way to go, you know?
Yeah, and it's funny because Biden and Harris are probably the Democrats who are the most anti-cannabis of all the Democrats, and they're the ones who won, but they're getting pushed. And so I'm actually looking to see, I don't care whatever else they do.
Right.
If they do a really full federal level, legalize, decriminalize, and free all the incarcerated, I'll rep them. I have a lot of reservations about the both of them,
right,
but I will forever call them blessed if they do this one thing. And they certainly have the power to do so, as we've been seeing that executive hand has been moving very swiftly over the past week or two.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a whole nother conversation, just our American political system. But I think everything is at a point now that's just crying out for justice. And it's my personal belief that we won't get it until we're intimately unified with the Spirit of Christ. For he is justice, capital J, and we are all poor imitations of it. Our systems scream it because we made these systems from our own intellect, from our own standards. And you see, because we've done that, we do so many things that don't actually ever get to the heart of justice. We just do things to help the symptoms of injustice. But we never are really positioning ourselves to actually become healthy again. And so, as you said, like we're crawling right now. It's like, okay, here's a little medicine. You're still on life support, but we're going to make sure we're going to keep the power on so you can still take another breath. But it's like, we want to get off life support. We want to actually live for a living, you know? And so I think these conversations are important for people to hear. Like we hear about our legal industry, and we celebrate those who have become attorneys, and we celebrate those who engage in it. But there are much bigger issues that we should be focusing on as and encouraging those who do find themselves in the industry to do all they can to be those justice warriors, to be willing to speak up, to be that voice in the wilderness, crying out, saying, hey, there's something wrong with the system. And that's exactly what happened. Like this didn't change because the system got together and said, okay, this is something we want to do. It was actually started by the franchise saying, hey, wait a second, this is unjust. Yo, I just spent mad years in law school, thousands of dollars doing all these different hoops. And then you make this test so outrageous that I still can't, like, something's off here, you know? And so it does take those voices in the wilderness. And so regardless of the industry you might find yourself in, like, I think the more we have people who are willing to speak up when they see injustice, regardless of where they find themselves, the better we will all be for it.
That's real. And, you know, we began starting to talk about this thing on my head, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about reconciliation. That one of the reasons I'm rocking it is obviously to press the hair down. But another reason is that this is common ground between the ADOS, the blacks of the United States, and Ethiopia. You know, one of the major founders of the modern Ethiopian nation state is Emperor Menelik. And in almost every photo you find of this guy, he's got a do-rag on. Sometimes he's got the do-rag by itself. Sometimes he's got a hat on top of it, but he's almost always rocking it. Right. And in America, obviously the place of the Dewey is well known. It's in many Twitter bios and elsewhere. And what I want to do is couch our conversation because we've been talking about this, and some people shut down immediately when they hear these conversations. And to those people, I want to emphasize something that I did, and I think you're not too different from me. While I was an undergraduate, I was working alongside people to create what was called the Loqui graduation. It was an environment in which a lot of other universities had Black graduations separate from the main graduation. Of course, there's also the specifics of your degree as well, or your major or your minor, whatever it may be. And so there was a call for a lot of people at Pepperdine to create a Black graduation. The numbers weren't there. The coalitions weren't there. So they said, let's compromise and make it a people of color. Now people use the BIPOC acronym to refer to indigenous people, Black people, people of color, all that together. And let me tell you this, like, I had such a deep expectation, and there's something unique and distinct about Ethiopian than being, like, there are similarities, but there are distinctions between being ADOS and being more recently from Africa, or at least having parents who are more recently from Africa. And I had this huge expectation where the bachelor's degree was never in question. It was like, what about the master's and the PhD and all this, that? So for me, I also hate the ritual of the graduation. It feels burdensome to me. It feels like I'm not doing it for me. I don't get pleasure out of it. I'm doing it for my family. And so for all those reasons, I had no interest, in addition to my major graduation, in addition to the normal graduation, of going and doing a Black or a people of color graduation. I had no interest in that. And yet
Yeah.
I fought for people who would be interested in taking advantage of that, of having access to that, and of celebrating that. And so I'm not the person who is out there arguing about quotas for
Right.
people of color. I'm not the person pushing for what was it, the Proposition 16 that was on the ballot to try to flip away discrimination laws in the state of California, which did actually fail on the ballot this past November. I'm not the person seeking to always take advantage of resources like that for myself. And yet, for people who I think are affected, for people who do want to take advantage of that and grant access to that, I have been that person. And I imagine you're not too different as well. People have thrown shade at the blackness of Kamala, for example, because her family is from the Caribbean, and they want to distinguish even within North America, the Caribbean versus the continental U.S. As some family with some of that heritage. Have you had a different perspective or thoughts on that in this regards as well?
In regards of in regards to exactly what?
Like, I don't always hear you saying all the time or pledging all the time, again, there needs to be this amount of Black people in this position, or else this, that, and the third. But in a general sense, you are saying that it's good that they've re-examined this policy, which was barring certain people in a likely disproportionate way that had a lot to do with socioeconomic status, but which highly also correlates to race and ethnicity and all that.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Just as this will be a bit narrative too, or as well. It's like I said, when you're in law school and you're around law, you're around the legal industry, law internships, you really start to observe the culture. And it's definitely a culture, a very privileged culture. And even like the indoctrination starts when you begin law school. Of like, just even in our language, we refer to people who aren't studying as laymen. You know what I mean? And that's not anything like that immediately rings off any alarms. But it's subtle, and but I realized the first year, the way our professors talked to us, the way people had a bit more, they kind of stuck their chest out a little bit. There is social value to being in the industry, and so that can sometimes distance you from being as effective as one should be, because you're enjoying the social benefit of what the title comes with, without necessarily always having to be burdened with the burden that title should come with, if that makes sense. And so I found several just in the industry more interested in what it meant for them, what it meant for their life, what it meant for their social status, as opposed to what their life would mean for those they might be called to serve. And so the indoctrination is thick, like it is truly thick in the industry. And so you have to have somewhat of a rebellious spirit in order to say, like, I'm not necessarily here for that. And then I think in terms of like the numbers, I'm not necessarily interested in the quotas or numbers as well, but I am interested in making sure that those who are called, that their opportunity to do what they've been called to do is not stripped away from them unfairly. And so whenever we start to put extra qualifications on someone or something that God may be qualifying to do a certain work, that's when we need to really be careful and start to watch. Not because I'm fearful of what the repercussions might mean for men, but because of what they might mean from, our Creator. And that's when we start to see his declarations of judgment come down. Whenever we start to say, yes, you might be called to do that. Yes, there's some people we clearly see you have that right spirit. You've got the intellect for it. You've got everything. And so like we start to agree with people that you believe you're called to do this. We've observed you, and we also believe, like, you're a great mediator. I've watched the way you've operated in our own friend group when we've been in we've had arguments. You know, I've watched it and I've been able to testify. No, this brother's a good mediator. You know what I'm saying? You might want him on a team. And so there is value to being able to see naturally that God has made us all with certain skill sets and certain gifts. And I never want to do anything too overly burdened to make it so, even though you are clearly called, your community believes that you're called, you're already doing that which you have been called to do. At the end of that, somehow to have anything that could arbitrarily disqualify you in a way that isn't genuine or sincere, that's where we need to really start to speak up. And that's what I fear happens far too often. And so I think we need to kind of, I know you start to move us there sometimes just in our own conversations of the idea of just letting competition be competition, or the free market be the free market, and letting more freedom in place so that people can kind of self-select into what God may have called them to do without us unduly burdening them in some arbitrary way. And so the more I think about the legal industry, that's just what I have more experience with. But I know that comes in place in so many other industries. And so I know it's not an isolated conversation. And so if we abstract it out, these same principles will apply across many different disciplines. We need to be mindful that how we're qualifying people, we aren't creating new qualifications that don't have actually anything to do with what the job actually entails. The qualifications should, like, if you're going to go to NBA, you should be able to play at the NBA level. We shouldn't make it so you have to pass an algebra test. You know, that's not required for the game of basketball. You know what I mean? Like, and so that will be odd if you were drafted high, if you had the vertical, you had the jump shot, you had the handle, you had the basketball IQ, you had a good team player. I mean, on the draft boards, you were ranked high. You could do everything that will be required of you for any team. And yet you get through the draft process, draft night comes, and they say, oh, we would have drafted you and you should be in the league, but you didn't pass this algebra test. Like, that would be, people would say that's very weird, but that's exactly what ends up happening in so many of our disciplines. But because we don't see it that way, it's hard for us to address it. And so I think the clearer vision we have about these decisions in these industries, I think the better off we'll be long term, and the more likely we'll be able to actually address injustice.
That's right. That's a good word. So the way you described it, it's funny, without getting into the differences, for example, between like Protestantism and the high church, whether it's Anglican, Catholic, Church of the East, Greek Orthodox, or my Afro-Asiatic Orthodox. It sounds very clerical. And so we were up to this point, and we still are, because it's only a halfway measure. It's not like they abolished it. They lowered what the qualification was. Yeah. And so it's a statute-based clerical society that is determining the merit a limited amount of times. 1, 2, 3, however many steps there are. You named several of the steps. It could be up to 5 steps, from the LSAT through the bar. Mm-hmm. And the reverse of that, which I mentioned, the sharing economy, the P2P economy, it's not that there's no regulation. It's that instead of having bureaucrats or clerics or statute determine that regulation, because they're placing trust in that group is going to be preventing a larger conversation from happening. Right. You have, and I love the NBA example that you gave, because in the NBA, like you said, it's not that they have to pass a written algebra test without a calculator. Right. It's that the coaches, the owners, the fans, the teammates are in a constant conversation, a constant evaluation of the skill sets, of the merit, of the qualification of that person based off of continuing and ongoing performance. And that, across all these different classes of people who are diverse, is the basis of which their qualification or their merit is being determined. And that there is no logical reason. You are the rhetorician, I am the logician. There's no logical reason why that cannot be applied to the class of job known as attorney or lawyer.
Absolutely. And especially when you have already, like, something in place that should naturally qualify. We call it law school, the school in which we enter in order to learn the law so that we might practice. And if you can go through law school, and I think law school needs to be seriously restructured and rethought about, but I'm okay with starting there. And if you graduate, you come out of there with a law degree, you should be good to go. You should be good to go. But that's not the case. Someone can spend 3 years of their life literally studying the law, literally doing what lawyers do, and somehow at the end of it, unable
and you're talking about getting the JD too, because I went to law school, but again, I got the Master of Dispute Resolution,
right.
and I'm with you on there. I would add the sort of practitioner ability too, because my favorite classes in law school were actually my clinics. I don't know if it was for you. We needed that kind of theory, that legal research writing in the beginning, but eventually you need to practice. And for me, almost every video game I've ever played, I used to joke the manuals for Danny, which was my cousin and brother that used to live with me. I used to give him the manual and say, I'm not reading this manual. And I would learn kinesthetically through movement, through playing, through tinkering. And I think that's my personality type. There are different personality types, but certainly if you've got that theoretical grounding, that should be enough. And then, you prove yourself constantly. Like,
for sure.
We're not saying don't qualify. We're not saying don't have merit.
Exactly.
We're saying what is the arena?
Right.
Just like when you're choosing between the various appellate courts, what is the arena? Or even at the lower court, if you're in small claims, limited liability, or unlimited, what is the arena for, or what is the jurisdiction for this qualification or this merit?
Exactly. And that's kind of that's the part I enjoyed about law school most, was kind of second and third year, where you have a lot more electives. That's where you do your clinics, you do your trial teams. I did 2 clinics, one at the Union Rescue Mission, and then that domestic violence clinic I told you about. And those are the things that really do qualify you and get you a sense of being able to practice, because it regardless, once you get to a law firm, when I worked at a law firm, like it was just training anyway, because I was working in class action. That's not on the bar exam. And so most times you get actually into your law job, you're being trained for the first 3-4 months anyway. Like literally, no matter how well you did it, or no matter what, it's like you are about to be trained, because, and that has to then why did I do the bar exam? If the bar exam cannot walk with me into my new job, why do I have to spend 3 months doing something that really has no real correlation to what I'm about to do? And so we definitely need to rethink just a lot of how we do things. You're right. It's become so bureaucratic. It's become so statute based that we've lost touch with actual reality. To put it as frankly as I possibly can, I think we've actually lost touch with reality, and we're forcing people to live in a fictional world. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, I really hope people take our words under consideration.
Yes.
When I was in the court, there were 2 different types of judges. There was the one judge that would tell you right on the spot what their decision was. The other would say, I'm going to take it under consideration, whether they want to or not, because they don't want the people to explode in the courtroom. And they say, you're going to get the answer in the mail
right now.
Yeah. And so I hope they take our words under consideration. Mm-hmm. In closing, do you have anything that you would like to plug or shout out, or maybe we'll bring you back for many different episodes on teaching the good folks a little bit more about the law, as this all goes in effect, I believe, next month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, March 1st. Yeah. No, man, I just appreciate you for having these kind of conversations. I think that's what I want to plug. We need more people like you that are willing to start the dialogue, because I think a lot of people do have thoughts and things to say. It's just a lot of times we lack the forums and the spaces where we can have a true meeting of the minds. And we're all like the word says, iron sharpens iron. And so we all naturally bring our own gifts, our own perspectives, outlooks. And when we can all gather around a similar table and start to mull over some of the things we're seeing, we all can leave enriched, because the things I'm bringing to the table are different than what you're bringing, different than what someone else is bringing. But I think we need each perspective in order to really truly assess the gravity in which I think just so many modern situations actually are in. I'm only one man, so I can only experience things through my experience. And so there are other things that people have been burdened with that I have not been burdened with. But we need to hear about those burdens, because I know that person is probably not the only one experiencing that. And so I just honor you, man, for being diligent and having these sort of spaces often, that where you just bring up different things that we need to be thinking about, that we need to be discussing, and creating a space for us to actually do that. And so I think more than anything, this is ever important, especially in a time like this.
Thank you very much, Rmani, and shout out to Matt C. He was kind of double stamping what we were saying earlier. He says, in his opinion, the purpose of standardized testing is to see if you can follow directions well, which kind of matches what we were saying earlier on in the broadcast. I don't know what point he hopped in, and that you need over 3 years of prep for that. It is a bad format, and what we're doing is just pontificating about possible replacements. We'll let other people decide that in the future. And thank you again, Rmani.
Yes, I appreciate you, brother.